The first law of broadcasting is that nothing is ever as good as it used to be. Even, according to Dr Carl Dolmetsch, the time signal.
Well, this all began 3 years ago, when I suddenly noticed that the BBC pips for the time signal had dropped by a semitone from B natural to B flat.
The acute listener will at once have noticed a mysterious coincidence here. Was it not also just 3 years ago that an axe was dangled over the sacred wickets of Test cricket? Among other threatened upheavals, were there not early warnings of a flood of news rolling across the Radio 4 long wave? All of which, strange to say, diverted the attention of the press from the altogether more vital question of the pips. Slippage thereof.
And when it had remained there for 2 weeks, that's when I wrote my first letter to the Telegraph 3 years ago. And that brought a little correspondence, not very much, but the chief thing was that almost stealthily, you might say, the time signal was restored to its former B natural.
It is not widely known that the first ever radio time signal was performed on the tubular bells by a Mr. Stanton Jeffries, whose ear was unfortunately rather less sensitive than that of Dr. Dolmetsch. He, in July of this year, found himself once again obliged to exchange recorder for pen to the editor of the Daily Telegraph.
Sir, I notice that once again the pips have dropped in pitch, etc. And that brought a great deal more attention, including telephone calls and interviews in this very room.
No doubt what was exciting the collective, if small brain of Fleet Street was that perennial mystery, what are the pips? From whence cometh they? Many the philosopher who has contemplated such matters in his bath. As early as 1928, the quest was featured in the already definitive knob-twiddler's guide to the airwaves, the Radio Times. The fundamental source of true time, it declared with Reithian certainty, is a pendulum bolted to the wall in the deepest dungeon of the castle of Duke Humphrey of Gloucester, on the site of which Greenwich Observatory was built. In 1990, however, having served 66 years without remission, the pips were handed into the keeping of the BBC Engineering Department. Happily, these new guardians of official time proved to be readers of the Daily Telegraph and were anxious to improve the deteriorating condition of their charge.
And I was a bit touched by that and thought about it, especially when they restored the note from B flat to B natural.
The source is revealed. No pendulum, no dungeon, just a box of wires in a dusty basement of Broadcasting House. Time, it seems, must move with the times.
Basically, an oscillator which gets fired every time a pip is due to go out. The problem was that due to age of the electrical components, it had drifted flat in frequency. And repairing it was just a simple case of adjusting a few resistors inside.
Given a little prompting from a few resistors outside. Once upon a time, there was no time to be upon. That is to say, no standard time. Time, it could be argued, was relative long before Einstein. If anything, relativity speaking can be said to come before anything else. Be that as it may, once upon a pre-wireless age, the clocks of town halls and churches across the land ticked and chimed as they pleased, until the blessed John Reith endowed the nation with an all-singing, all-dancing timepiece.
22 minutes past 11.
It's 10 o'clock.
It's 7 minutes to 1.
It's 10 to 5.
21 and a half minutes past 12.
Surprisingly, when he decreed that nation shall squeak pips unto nation, no one asked why he couldn't come up with a prettier tune.
Let's go to an A, or C being a more important note in music. So that was what I suggested.
We have had musical pips in the past as a joke.
But the time reference itself, the 6 pips have always been 1,000 cycles approximately, right back from the day they were first introduced way back in 1924.
If there was to be a change, instead of going to B flat, it'd be much more useful if it would go to A, because that is the note to which musicians like to tune.
You caught me on the hop with that.
When I was being interviewed about the pips, one of the interviewers asked, well, what are you going for next? And so, again, irresponsibly, I said, oh, Big Ben. I like things to be in tune, relatively in tune.
The belfry at the Palace of Westminster lies, as the pigeon flies, some 207 feet above pavement level.
What I'm concerned with is the relativity of the intervals with each other. And the Big Ben tune is in the key of F major, starting with an F.
Or, as a BBC sound recordist climbs, 334 spiral stone steps.
The G is about right. The C, very flat. And then when you get to the bong on a low F, an octave lower, that is flat to the average established by the chimes. So instead of something like this,
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
and then something, this is the news read by Katrina Young. Now, these intervals are in tune with each other, but what we hear is something like...
Big Ben, when it was designed, was meant to be an E natural. Just as it got put into place back in about 1859, a crack developed in it, and the bell was turned about 90 degrees, so it now strikes on a different part. So the fact that it's got a crack in it may make the sound be slightly away from E natural, but I couldn't be certain of that, not being an expert sound engineer.
So never mind for whom the bell tolls. Does it matter that it tolls off key?
No, not at all, because if it was bang on, then it wouldn't be Big Ben as we all know and love. I mean, the sound is the sound that you get and people recognise. If it has altered, then it's given it a character of its own.
Well now, here we are dealing with a 13.5-ton bell.
That's the mechanism priming itself for the next set of chimes.
It has been said that the cogs and cables of the giant mechanism look quite remarkably like the inside of a cuckoo clock, as viewed by the cuckoo. It has also been calculated that an amazing 56 real-life cuckoos could perch wing to wing on the minute hand alone, if they wished. Starlings, on the other hand, being both punier and more gregarious, could probably squeeze a few extra on board.
In the early 1950s, a flock of starling birds settled on the hands, and the weight of birds sitting on the hands stopped the clock working.
There is rather more to retuning Big Ben than tweaking the odd resistor, as even Dr. Dolmetsch recognizes.
The world knows that I've devoted my life to excellence in early music. That is to say, no matter what century it comes from, it must be done well, not just historically. And that means perfectionism in whatever you're playing. And I wouldn't count my comments on pips and bongs as being in any way a serious side of my career. To the editor of the Daily Telegraph, pitch restored.
BBC has announced that its cricket commentary radio programme, Test Match Special, is to continue.
Earlier plans to put continuous news on Radio 4, Longwave, were dropped after they ran into stiff public opposition.
Sir, I am delighted to report, further to my letter of July the 2nd, that the pips of the Greenwich Time Signal have now been restored to their former pitch of a slightly sharp B natural. Signed, Dr. Carl Dolmetsch, Hazelmere, Surrey.
The second law of broadcasting is that most things tend to continue pretty much as before.
Your guide to Radio Time was Peter Jones. The Time Signal was produced by Kate Fenton.